Hi there. This is becoming a really bad habit. I keep quoting Jensen Huang. Can't help it. So here goes another one. Jensen Huang, the CEO of Nvidia, sat across from Joe Rogan in December and said something that should have made every working person in America look up from their lunch. He said, if your job is just to chop vegetables, Cuisinart's going to replace you. Just. That word. Just is doing enormous work in that sentence. And Huang either doesn't know it or doesn't care. Because nobody's job is just anything. The line cook who chops vegetables also reads the pace of the kitchen, adjusts mice in place when the Friday rush hits early, trains the new kid without being asked, and holds together a crew that'll fall apart without the one person who knows where everything is and why it matters. Huang doesn't see any of that. He sees a task, a single, isolated, mechanical task. And having reduced a human being to a motion, he declares the motion replaceable. This is not a failure of vision, it's a failure of sight. I've spent 36 years on factory floors in Detroit, in Chennai, in Stuttgart, and now in Worcester, Ohio, where I run 3 production lines and 60 people who make stormwater pipes. I've watched a woman on the night shift adjust an extruder's temperature profile by listening to the sound it made. A diagnostic no engineer had documented and no sensor had been calibrated to detect. I've seen a forklift operator reroute an entire warehouse flow in real time because he noticed a humidity change that would warp the product before quality control ever caught it. These people are not chopping vegetables. They are carrying intelligence, earned, embodied, irreplaceable intelligence that their organizations neither measure nor pay for, nor, most damningly, even acknowledged. Huang cannot see this intelligence because he's never had to. He sits at the apex of a $3.3 trillion company whose entire business model depends on the proposition that computation can replace cognition. Of course, he believes it. His net worth requires him to. But it was his next remark that should truly alarm us. When Rogan asked what new jobs might emerge in an AI dominated economy, Huang offered this. You're going to have robot apparel. So, a whole industry of, isn't that right? Because I want my robot to look different than your robot. So, you're going to have a whole apparel industry for robots. Read that again. The man who sells the chips that will automate millions of jobs believes the displaced workers will find purpose, dressing the machines that replace them. This is not an economic vision. This is a feudal fantasy. The serfs, having been evicted from their fields, will be permitted to embroider the Lord's carriage. And when Rogan, to his credit, asked whether robots could eventually make apparel for other robots, Huang replied, eventually. And then there'll be something else. Something else. The great escape hatch of every technologist who has never had to file for an employment. Something else will appear. It always does. Trust the invisible hand. Trust the market. Trust us. I have a question for Mr. Huang. What did you tell the Luddites? Ah, the Luddites. And let's rescue them from the caricature that men like Huang depend on. We're not ignorant technophobes smashing machines out of stupidity. They were Yorkshire croppers, Nottinghamshire framework knitters, Lancashire cotton weavers, highly skilled artisans who had spent 7 years in apprenticeships learning to trim nap from woolen cloth so fine that it defined English textiles for generations. They were, in every sense that matters, the frontline intelligence of their industry. And then the gig mills came, and the shearing frames, and the power looms. Not because these machines made better cloth, the Luddites explicitly protested the inferior quality of machine produced goods, but because they made cheaper cloth using children and unskilled labor at a fraction of the cost. The manufacturers didn't want better, they wanted cheaper. Sound familiar? The croppers petitioned Parliament. They organized. They wrote letters. They tried every legal and democratic avenue available to them. And then, in 1809, Parliament, under pressure from the manufacturers, repealed every piece of protective legislation, stripping the artisans of their last recourse. Only then did the hammers come out. Only then did the midnight raids begin on the moors about Huddersfield. The British government's response was to deploy 12,000 troops, more soldiers than Wellington had in some peninsular war engagements, and to make machine breaking a capital offense. 17 men were hanged at York in January 1813. Others were transported to Australia. The movement was crushed. But the conditions that created it were not. Those conditions, a concentrated elite declaring workers redundant, an economy restructured for the benefit of capital owners, a political system captured by the manufacturers, produced the Chartist movement, the trade unions, the factory acts, and eventually the fundamental reshaping of British society. The croppers lost, but the forces they unleashed won. It just took longer and cost more than anyone had to pay if the manufacturers had simply recognized the intelligence their workers carried. This is the pattern that Huang and his fellow travelers, Elon Musk, who casually predicts that the cost of labor will eventually fall to zero, that the parade of venture capitalists currently pouring billions into humanoid robots refuse to see. Not because the pattern is hidden, but because seeing it would require questioning the premise that makes them rich. MIT's Project Iceberg tells us that AI can already perform work equivalent to 11.7% of the US labor market, 151 million workers, 1.2 trillion in wages. That number is not a forecast of job losses. It is a capability map. It tells us what AI can do, not what it will do. The difference between these two things is entirely a matter of human decision, of choices made by executives, by policymakers, by the people who control capital. And right now, the people who control capital are telling us, don't worry, you'll make clothes for robots. I am an immigrant. I've been an immigrant for 40 years. I came to this country with an engineering degree and a belief, naive perhaps, but unshakable, that if I worked hard enough, if I learned the systems, if I built the capability, I would earn my place. And I did. I ran factories at General Motors. I turned around Royal Enfield in India and grew its profits 20-fold in 4 years. I served as COO of companies on 2 continents. I hunkered down with my 401k and my mortgage payments and my children's college funds doing what immigrants do, which is to build without the luxury of assuming the ground beneath you is permanent. I say this not for sympathy, but for standing. Because when Jensen Huang reduces a human being to a vegetable chopping function and then imagines a future where the displaced dress robots for a living, he's not describing my workers. He's not describing the woman who adjusts the extruder by ear or the man who reroutes the warehouse by instinct. He's describing a fantasy populated by abstractions, labor inputs, and productivity curves and market corrections where real people with real families and real rent payments do not exist. And I want to ask him, with the full weight of history behind the question, do you understand what happens when you tell 151 million people that they are abstractions? The French Revolution was not about cake. The Flint sit-down strikes of 1936 and 37 were not about ideology. The Triangle Shirtwaist fire of 1911, which killed 146 garment workers, mostly immigrant women, mostly young, locked in a building by owners who feared they would steal scraps of fabric, did not produce labor reform because politicians suddenly developed consciences. It produced reform because the public finally saw what the factory owners had always known and never cared about, that the people inside the building were people. Every revolution in the history of labor has followed the same arc. First, the owners declare the workers redundant. Then the workers are told to be patient, that something else will come. Then the patience runs out. Then the streets fill. Then, and only then, the reforms arrive. Reforms that could have been enacted decades earlier at a fraction of the cost in human suffering if anyone with power had bothered to look at the people standing in front of them. Huang is not evil. Musk is not evil. They are captive to a model of the world in which human beings are cost centers to be optimized, not capability reservoirs to be deployed. They are so deep inside their own wealth, so surrounded by people who profit from agreeing with them, that they have lost the ability to see what a night shift worker in Worcester, Ohio sees every single day. That intelligence lives in the hands and eyes and instincts of ordinary people, and that destroying it in the name of efficiency is not innovation, it is waste. There is another way. I've spent the last several years building a framework I call the Bloom system, which treats labor not as a depreciating cost, but as an appreciating asset. I call it capability capital. The premise is simple, and to anyone who has actually managed a factory floor, obvious. The people closest to the work carry intelligence that no algorithm has ever been trained on, no sensor can detect, and no consultant spreadsheet will ever capture. Deploy that intelligence, invest in it, structure it, give it room to compound, and you get results that automation alone cannot deliver. This is not sentimentality. This is accounting. When I deployed Frontline intelligence at GM's Lansing Grand River assembly plant, the result was JD Power Gold. Not because we installed best robots, but because we listened to the people the robots were supposed to replace. When I turned Royal Enfield around in India, the 20-fold profit growth came not from automating the workforce, but from unleashing the capability that was already there, suppressed by decades of management that treated workers exactly the way Huang treats his hypothetical vegetable chopper. The alternative to robot clothing is not nostalgia. It's not Luddism. It is the recognition that the 151 million workers in MIT's simulation are not a problem to be solved. They are an asset to be deployed. And the companies and nations that figure this out first will bury the ones that don't. Not because they are kinder, but because they are smarter. Huang ended his podcast appearance with an accidental confession. When Rogan asked whether robots would eventually make clothes for other robots, Huang said yes, and then added, and then there'll be something else. Something else. The two most dangerous words in the English language when spoken by a billionaire who has never had to wonder what comes next. I know what comes next. History knows what comes next. The Luddites knew, and the croppers of Yorkshire knew, and the garment workers of the Triangle Shirtwaist factory knew, and the sit-down strikers of Flint knew. What comes next is not something else. What comes next is everyone else. Thank you.